So, Robbie, one of the clear points that you are making in this particular book is that the white Christian church is like the center pole that holds up the tent called white supremacy. What do you mean when you say that?
Right. Well, that sounds like it is a big statement, and it comes early in the book, but I will say it came late in the research. Right.
Mm,
So it's
mm,
something that appears early in the book, but was really a conclusion built kind of brick by brick from the history, the current public opinion data, and it was this. I really a realization to me at the
mm,
end of how big and formidable white supremacy and the Christian support for white supremacy, had become. So, in our country's history, maybe the easiest way to get at this is to say, for most of our country's history, the dominant legitimizing force, that is the force that gave the status quo, whether we're talking about law, policy, cultural practices, that kind of blessed them, right, gave them approval, were white Christian churches, and particularly white Protestant churches that were the
mhm,
dominant cultural force through most of the country's history. So one way to say this is that we don't get anything blessed as a cultural practice or as law and morally legitimized as a cultural practice and law without the stamp of approval of white Christian churches in this country, right? Anything that white Christian churches had stood up and said, right, that doesn't comport with the gospel, that doesn't comport with how we see the world, would have been swept away. And I think we have to take that power really seriously. So that
mhm,
means that all the things that we have blessed, from slavery to Jim Crow to convict leasing programs to criminal justice inequities, all of these things, segregation in schools and swimming pools and all that stuff, all of that came with the blessing of white Christian churches. And I think it's not, I try to make the point, it's not just that white Christian churches sat on the sidelines and let all that happen, right? Like that's, I think, the story I think white Christians like to tell about ourselves.
mm,
But this was not just passive, but active
mm.
support from the pulpits, from church statements and resolutions and denominations, active support, right, for segregation and for slavery in a previous era, all of which had underneath it this idea that white people were intended by God to be at the top of the hierarchy, right? This was a deeply, deeply, explicitly held belief through most of our country's history.
Yeah, it's profound to me because you are very clear that it's not just that this kind of influence and power is not just in history, but it's present in this moment. And in this moment, when so much of the political and social discourse has centered on white evangelicals, you point out that really the whole of what we might call the white church is implicated in this.
That's right. I mean, we can go back, even in history, we see, it's not just the white evangelicals that are serving the Confederacy, right?
Mm-hmm,
I mean, every Protestant denomination split.
mm-hmm,
Every major denomination split. The Methodist split, the Episcopalian split, Presbyterian split, all over this fundamental issue of enslaving other people based on the color of their skin. And there were huge factions, right, on both sides of that. But what's notable, though, is that split over slavery, which may look like, oh, well, half the church went here and half the white church went there, was actually just over slavery. And I think one of the things I got clearer about writing this book is that slavery was never the fundamental issue. It was the issue that the war was fought over. But
mm-hmm.
after that issue gets settled, the issue of slavery itself, the issue of white supremacy survived quite easily.
Right.
That battle over slavery. I was going back and reading like Frederick Douglass after the Civil War, who was like utterly dismayed at all these white Christians from North and South who just so quickly mended the fences once the question of slavery was essentially settled, because the thing that they actually shared, even among many abolitionists, right,
Yes.
didn't believe
Yes.
in social equality between the races. They were against slavery. as an inhumane practice, but they by no means, most of them, were firmly committed. Charles Finney, for example, right? I cite in the book, corrected a young protege of his who was going to set up an interracial service, and he was like, no. You err in thinking that the issue of slavery and amalgamation are this. And the word he used was amalgamation, are the same. Like, we're against slavery, but we're not for the mixing of people in equally, socially equal ways in the church.
What also drove this home for me is I was reading your book after having spent a few weeks in Brazil with our kindred in the Aliança, the Alliance of Baptists of Brazil. And many of the leaders there were telling me the story of how the Aliança was formed just a few decades ago, and about how they were trying to find some kind of refuge from the repressive power of the Brazilian Baptist Convention. And when they started telling me the story of the Brazilian Baptist Convention, I was like, oh, that's us. Like, that's the white Christian church importing this theology, this framework, this hierarchy, to other places. I think for me, that's when I began to recognize that if this can be imported, then I probably haven't paid enough attention to the power of this in my own context. So when your book came along, it was quite helpful to help me begin to further unpack the impact of the white church on our culture, on our policies, on our lived realities. So your thesis focuses, I think, on understanding the institutional power of the white Christian church. Is that right? Just to say that the focus of this is trying to really understand the kind of power that can be wielded at the institutional level?
I think it's about that for sure, and for the responsibility then that white Christian institutions have to dismantle the things that they built, right, with this kind of white supremacist assumptions. And I should say just really quickly, because I know in many white circles, when the word white supremacist gets used, there's a kind of a defensive reaction to it.
Yes.
So I want to say just one bit about that, that I'm not really talking about here, like I think what most white people conjure up is some black and white image of people in hoods burning a cross or lynching someone, right? And then the benefit of thinking about white supremacy that way for contemporary white people is that it distances it from us, right? Oh, that's those people, back in my great grandparents' day, and it literally is in many people's in black and white image, right? Something like Birth of a Nation or something like that. Grainy black and white image, just way back there, nowhere near us.
Yes.
But what I'm talking about here is just if we just flip the words around, instead of saying white supremacy, which conjures that defensive reaction, and say what we're really talking about is a belief in the supremacy of whites, right? And belief that there is a kind of racial hierarchy and that we white people are intended to be on the top of it. And again, this was theologically supported with readings of Genesis and, all kinds of things that we could point to. But that's the thing that I think has been the harder thing to excise, right? Is this internal belief. So I think I am talking about institutions and the power that those institutions have operated with that underlying assumption. And I think but I am also talking about the way that institutions with those assumptions have formed people generation after generation after generation, right? Yes. And how that has impacted how we think about everything from who Jesus was to what salvation means to what sin means. Like our entire kind of theological worldview is shot through with a pre-commitment to the idea that whites are intended to be at the top of a racial hierarchy.
Well, I asked this question because, at the time of this recording, we're just days away from the Alliance affirming a new covenant and revising bylaws and receiving a report on our racial justice work that all point to our aspirations to be anti-racist in our institution and in our cultural practices together. When I teach about race, we talk about how race is intrapersonal, how it's intrapersonal. It's about our own biases and often implicit, as well as our own personal experience and trauma related to race. That racism is interpersonal, that it's about what happens between people, but that it's also institutional and structural, that it's about policies and practices and ways of being, and they also live in broader cultures in ways that feel even more invisible. Almost, you can almost feel it, you can almost breathe it, but you can't always put words to it. And that's important that we pay attention to all of those dimensions of how we experience race and racism, or sexism and misogyny, or homophobia, whatever the oppression of difference might be. And so much of our conversations about race tend to stay at the intrapersonal level, where someone's trying to determine whether or not they have a racist bone in their body. And I'm always like, all of our bones are racist. Racism is bone deep. Let's stop saying that. Or whether or not what's happening between people is an example of racism. But I think more insidious and more powerful are the things that happen in the institutions that actually shape who we are. And so I appreciate you lifting that up. So I think it makes a lot of sense for us to pay attention to the work at that level. In fact, I believe that it's at that level that we then are able to address the other dimensions of race and racism.
Yeah, just one quick comment on that. I mean, I think it's one of the things that I think Baptists in particular, I say white Baptists in particular of all stripes, have been one weakness, I think, of our theology is that we don't have very many tools for thinking structurally about things. Right? We tend to think very individualistically. Sin is individual, salvation is individual, like racism is individual and interpersonal. But I want to say this: that is by design, right? Mm-hmm. And if there's something we should repent of, it is that we have allowed ourselves to construct this highly individualistic theology that blinds us to the principalities and powers of systemic racism in the country. Like, that is the biggest growth point, I think, for most white Christians and white Baptists in particular, is to realize how that hyper individualistic theology has protected us from seeing the realities of racism in the country at the institutional and systemic level. And the continued denial of that is probably the biggest manifestation of white supremacy in the country today. Wow.
That's huge. That last statement there, the biggest, that denial is the manifestation is profound. There is a lot of research in this book. I first read your book as an audiobook on my walks. And I realized I'm not going to be able to finish this book on these walks, because once he gets to the numbers, I just can't plot them out in my head. And so I had to go back. But you had some profound research in here, and you had some research where you're talking about the relationship between white Christians and racism, and you had talked about there was a spectrum from most racist to least racist, and there were some outcomes there that related to how evangelicals polled here, and how Protestants and Catholics polled, but also how unaffiliated, like religiously unaffiliated whites polled. Could you say something about that research and what it means?
Yeah. Well, I'll first say that I did try to confine all the numbers to one chapter in the book, mercifully for most readers. But and there's a little summary at the end for everyone who's going to plod through all the machinations. But I did want to make sure I had the receipts.
That's right. That's right.
And so that's what the chapter is really about. Is about, if we look at contemporary public opinion data, how do we still see white supremacy among us, right? And the real question I was asking in that chapter is, do white Christians look different than other white people? Right. Mm-hmm. So I was really trying to compare what work is Christianity doing among white Americans today?
Good question. Yes.
Is it helping white people on this front? Is it hurting them? What's going on? Or is there any difference at all between whites who profess to be Christian and whites who don't in the country. So that's really what the chapter was up to. And so as a kind of diagnostic tool, I developed 15 different questions that were kind of around systemic racism, various ways. I tried to get a breadth of questions. So I did ask about things like Confederate monuments and flags, people's perceptions of those. But I also asked about whether past discrimination has effects in the present, whether police like our current criminal justice system and police treatment of people is fair, or whether there is racial disparities there. I mean, and so across a whole range of questions, like 15 different questions, I then built them into a composite index and scored it 1 to 10. Right, is the kind of easiest way to think about this. And with kind of 1 holding the least racist attitudes, 10 holding the most racist attitudes. And it may not surprise people to find out that white evangelicals scored 8 out of 10 on that index. But I think it may surprise more people that white mainline Protestants, right, people tend to think of the American Baptists and Methodists and your Episcopalians, who people tend to think about as more liberal in the country, scored 7 out of 10 on that scale. And white Catholics, who have their own experience of discrimination, being discriminated against in this country, also on the basis of ethnicity and religion, also scored 7 out of 10 on the scale. And if you compare those groups to whites who claim no religious affiliation, the whites who claim no religious affiliation only scored 4 out of 10 on this scale, right? So what you basically see is if you take the average white person and you add Christianity, they move up the scale, right? Rather than down. And even when I looked at things like church attendance, right, to say, okay, well, maybe these are just Christians in name only. They kind of claim the label, but they're not really connected to a church. And I should also say, with a lot of statistical controls in place, I was controlling for partisanship, region of the country, urban versus rural, gender, income, education. Like I controlled for all kinds of things to make sure it wasn't just about that. Even with those controls in place, what you see is that those relationships stand up. And when you look at church attendance, at best, church attendance made no difference in these models, right? So it didn't improve one way or the other. It did have an effect only among white evangelical Protestants, but in the opposite way that you might hope, right? In other words, the relationship between being white evangelical and holding more racist attitudes was stronger among those who attended more frequently than it was among those who attended less frequently.
So what do we do? What do we do with that? And like, what do you want your white kindred in the alliance? I mean, the alliance is a family that you're connected to. As someone who grew up Baptist, I always thought I first met you in an alliance context. What do you want your white kindred in the alliance, or even all your kindred in the alliance, white or not, to do with this kind of information?
Well, I think. It's kind of 2 things, like, that one is that I think particularly among kind of my white kindred in the Baptist world and others who are trying to do this work, I think to realize that, this is going to be the work of generations to do, right? And I honestly think this generation is the one laying the foundation for a new house that's going to get built. Right. Because it's just now that we're taking this seriously. Like in my entire lifetime. Right. I was born in 1968, came of age in the 70s and 80s.
Same here. 68.
And, there was nothing like, all the way up through my Baptist college, my Baptist seminary. There was nothing happening right in this space. And so we are the generation that is finally saying, OK, it's time to rebuild. It's time to do something new, and we got to put it on a different foundation. It's not like we can't just, put a new roof on, right? To kind of continue this metaphor and feel like we're good, right? We don't have a leaky roof. We've got a busted foundation, right? And so it's going to have to start from the ground up being rebuilt. Now, there's something daunting about that, but I also think there's something quite exciting. And there's a moment of kind of creative effervescence that I think that's a calling, right? I mean, that's something that is the work of the Spirit moving in a new way. we can be a part of that. But I think we should also realize that, well, what we're going to try to do, let's lay a true foundation, and it's going to be our children and grandchildren. They're going to build something new on it. But we got to do the work to kind of lay that cornerstone right.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to close, but I wonder if I could just get you to read that quotation from James Baldwin that was the inspiration for the title, because it sounds like what I just heard you lay out there is a way that we might actually respond to the ruminations and questions that were in the mind of James Baldwin.
Yeah, I'll just say, so the title of the book comes from this quote. And, one way I think also of reading this book, I just found, I came to Baldwin late in life. And, the more I read of him, the more I realized that he was saying things to white America that white America wasn't really ready to hear. And one of the reasons why we're still reading Baldwin 50 years on is because I hope we may be at a place where we're finally ready to at least hear some of what he was saying. He was laying it out, right, to white America more than 50 years ago. And so one way of thinking about this is, Baldwin, was a gay black man from Harlem, and I think one way of thinking about this is this book is like my white straight guy from Mississippi's trying to be a response, right? Trying to give an adequate response to the stuff that it's a really troubling indictment, right? And the thing about Baldwin is, he's so incisive, but he's also not really bitter. And the stuff so I think there's a kind of faithful indictment, I think, from Baldwin, where he's kind of calling us to love. And so I want to say that because this thing I'm about to read sounds pretty harsh. He was never one to mince words, but he was also never one, I think I write in the book, to dip his pen in the well of hatred. Right? I mean, he was always calling white America to its better self, but doing it in a way that, was kind of painful.
Sometimes, at a cost to himself.
That's right. Yeah. So the immediate context for this is he was writing in the New York Times just a few months after Martin Luther King Jr. had been gunned down. Right. So this is the context. He's writing in this deep sense of really despair and pain in that very dark moment in our history. And so this is what he writes. He says, I will flatly say that the bulk of this country's white population impresses me, and has so impressed me for a very long time, as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They have been married to the lie of white supremacy too long. The effect on their personalities, their lives, their grasp of reality has been as devastating as the lava which so memorably immobilized the citizens of Pompeii. They are unable to conceive that their version of reality, which they want me to accept, is an insult to my history and a parody of theirs and an intolerable violation of myself. So I've probably read this quote about 100 times now, and it still hits me when I read it. Because this is 50 years on, and we have not moved much further than this. I'm hopeful that the kind of conversation we're having now is part of a turn. That we'll be able to look back and say, I don't know, this is where it shifted.
This is the moment. Well, I can't thank you enough for your work and for the work of PRI and the contribution that you made to what is a pretty significant moment in the history of our country and the kind of conversations that we're having. And I'm grateful that the Alliance is blessed to be able to engage your work and to engage this moment with you. Thank you so much, dear brother.
It's really, really kind, Michael Ray, and happy to be here. Thank you.